and all items basically has been gone up about 7 or 8%, and then energy, gasoline, fuel oil, natural gas, electricity has been going up considerably more than that. Here's a little color demonstration of the last 10 years. Red is higher numbers. White is in between, and green is lower numbers. So the darker green is low inflation. The dark red is higher inflation. And you can see, I don't know how well you can see on your monitors, but the Federal Reserve, which is in charge of controlling the money supply in the United States, has done pretty darn good job in managing inflation over time. The goal, I think, is about 1.5 or 2 to 2.5% per year, and that's where we've been. We've been in very low inflation. When the pandemic started, there was a recession, a very, very short recession where like the economy went to heck. You remember, in the first few months of the pandemic, and then government intervention took over across the globe, and then it started having an impact last year early as we started to emerge from some of the phases of the pandemic. And last year was high, and this year was higher. This is on the left-hand side. We'll start on the right-hand side. So thinking about budget. So this is part of a series, right? This first presentation is about inflation, recession. It's about kind of like setting the kind of landscape of what's happening around us. And then we're going to be talking specifically about pay and salaries and wages. And then next week, we'll talk about expenses, disposable, discretionary spending, non-discretionary spending, looking at a budget for a library, trying to make decisions as you're faced with a cut or maybe level funding. And then the third session, which is 2 weeks from now, we'll be talking about revenue streams and funding. So like, what are some creative ways to get funding, and what are some things that we could talk about to help us along that way. On the left-hand side, so for planning purposes, it looks like about 6% this year for inflation, and the forecast from the Congressional Budget Office is a little more than 3% next year. So the Federal Reserve, the Fed, is doing everything possible by raising interest rates to cool off the economy, which will reduce buying, which will reduce the pressure on inflation. So they're hoping that we average at about 3.1% in 2023. So going to the left side of that slide, there's a calculator. It's a CPI Inflation Calculator. This is from the Bureau of Labor, for U.S. Bureau of Labor. And I took from the Vermont Public Library 2001 statistics the median revenue for all libraries. So if you took all the libraries on that spreadsheet and you went to the median, which is the middle, not the average, it's the middle of everyone, it's about $94,000 a year for revenue. I put that in the calculator. So January 1st, 2021, if you had a budget of about $94,000, it has the same buying power in August, that was just like a month and a half ago, of $106,000. So you can see what an impact inflation has had on our personal budgets, on our library budgets, on everything around. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you that going to the grocery store now is a bit of a surprise. Or I had a friend that just picked a bushel of apples, and they went to the checkout, and the bushel of apples, $90. So it's a kind of the spiral that I'll talk about next. So like, how does inflation work? And there's 3 different ways. This is from Investopedia. There's a lot of different sources for this kind of information. built-in. We are accustomed to built-in inflations. So it's kind of that cycle of, okay, what's the CPI? What's the wage increase going to be? You can think about your annual budgeting process. Okay, what's the town thinking about wage increases? Is it like 2%? Is it 3%? Is it 1.5%? Is it like 1.5% and then 1% more for merit? Oh, Joy, you have a comment or question?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat that it seems like we should clear up right away. Somebody just, whoever, if you could mute yourself, that would be great.
Hey, Joy, your audio isn't coming in very well, so I'm going to have the chat up on my screen so I can see it. And so Vicky asked, when you say revenue, do you mean average total library annual budget amount? That's correct. So that would be money coming from your town plus other revenue, like revenue from the Friends group or revenue from an endowment, if you're lucky or fortunate enough to have it, and sales and fees. So it's the total revenue for the library, not just the town appropriation. And you're right about most of the funding for nearly every public library. I think 99% of the public libraries receive town funding. And in a lot of cases, it could be 100% of funding. So thank you for that question, Vicky. So going back to my slide, built-in, okay, this is something that just happens when prices rise, wages rise. You have that expectation that you're going to get at least the 2 or the 1%, depending on what's happening with the CPI, what's happening with inflation. There's cost push. I'm moving from right to left when production costs increase prices. So you felt that at the gas pump, for instance, or you could feel it in the grocery store because the cost of producing that box of cereal was more because of energy costs, but transportation was way up. So that is pushing prices up. And on the left side is demand pull. So like demands of goods and services can increase prices significantly as well. I was just reading this morning that there's this like Birkenstock sandals are like going through the roof, the price of them, because of a TikTok thing. You know, look at me. Do I look like I do TikTok? No, but I did note that. And it's just like, man, I should have bought a bunch of Birkenstock sandals last year. So moving forward, so when we're talking about inflation too, the increase in the supply of money has a lot to do with kind of like the root of inflation. So there's a couple of examples I use. Printing and giving away more money to citizens increases inflation. Examples of this is a kind of a fascinating example to me, is that the gold plundered by the Spaniards in the Americas in the 1500s caused significant inflation in Europe, just because they were bringing in a lot of gold, a lot of currency. In 1920s, after World War I, Germany just their fiscal policy, they just printed more money. There's stories, you know, of people, just regular people, having kind of like a wheelbarrow full of German marks to go to the grocery store to buy bread and milk. Also, the third point there is loaning new money into existence through the banking system. So through the Federal Reserve. So Federal Reserve is selling government bonds, and that's how they raise money for the federal government, for the federal budget. This is what happened, for instance, in the American Rescue Plan. A significant part of the federal budget now is paying off loans. And this has happened across the world. So in the United States, we have gotten a lot more money in our pocket through the pandemic, through the American Rescue Plan, through a lot of other different programs. Money went to businesses, money went to the unemployed. You know, it depends on your political views, of course, that it was paid unemployment. or you know, just supporting families through this craziness. But it really increased the amount of money that was available to Americans in the United States to spend on products. And then the second thing, which is the kind of like the push inflation, is supply chain disruption. On the right-hand side is the producer price index, the cost of truck transportation. And you can see the bottom two lines, there's sort of like a kind of like a ochre colored and a gray colored, if you can see that, 2019, 2020, this is what the line usually looks like. 2021, it started to really spike. And then 2022 really is so much higher than it has been. So it's really costing a lot for trucking, transportation. So COVID-19, very disruptive to the economy. Labor has been a significant issue, as you know, and there's all sorts of aspects of the labor situation that have impacted inflation, the cost of going to a restaurant, all these things. I just read a statistic the other day that in modern memory, males between the age of 20 and 30 there's never been this high a percentage who live at home. So younger folks who live at home can make different decisions about whether they're going to work, what kind of work they do. You know, they have a little bit more fiscal leeway. For you know, folks with children, it's been devastating. You know, childcare is a huge issue, and it almost makes sense for a lot of people to stay out of the workforce because of childcare. Costs too much, or you can't get childcare. So labor has been a significant issue in our inflation scenario. War, of course, has been huge because of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. It's disrupted transportation, it's disrupted food supply. There is a bit of a wheat shortage, for instance, in the world right now. And of course, energy supplies and transportation, I had already mentioned. So moving to recession, the National Bureau of Economic Activity has a definition of what recession is. It's basically, you know, something that a decline in economic activity. Usually it's visible in the reduction of gross domestic product, which is a measure of the total market value of all the goods and the services that countries produce. And you can see on the right-hand side that we are, by some definitions, already in a recession. The first quarter and second quarter percent real growth in the gross domestic product has declined in the United States. And I have a little thing on my side there that says one person's spending is another person's income. So as economic activity declines, that is, as people spend less, there are some people who rely on that revenue, that spending, for their paycheck, and that starts affecting employment. It starts affecting people's income. This slide just is a little picture of gross domestic product across the world. It's you think about United States, you think about China as the dominant economic drivers in globally, and it's true. United States has the biggest value of goods and services produced. China is second, and so if what the United States does, what happens in the United States, like increasing interest rates, which puts pressure on other banking systems across the globe for them to increase interest rates, or it costs money for them, or as we increase interest rates, as the Federal Reserve increases interest rates, it actually attracts investment into the United States from other countries. So everybody is connected here globally. You know, we've always been connected globally for some time. Not, oh, you know, it's happened over the last century or two. But what happens in China, what happens in Russia, Japan, it affects everybody, particularly in the larger economies like the United States and China. This on the right hand side, this was a headline in the Motley Fool in September 21st. You know that the stock market has been dropping dramatically. I think we've lost over 20% of value since the first of the year. And the headline is today's sole Dow Jones stock winner just signaled a recession. And the stock winner was Walmart, because from a United States macro perspective, where do people go to shop in tight times? They're going to Walmart and some of the other big box stores. And just above there is Walmart revenue from 2022, almost $6 billion, $600 billion, which is about half the gross domestic product of Mexico, for instance. It's significant. Now, another thing that's happening is that consumer sentiment plays a big role in what happens to the economy. It's all about people and behavior on a macro issue. And I found it interesting that, okay, we've got inflation, so people are they're cutting back. A lot of folks, they're just buying the essentials. And sometimes those that could only buy the essentials are now having to decide what not to buy that's essential. The Federal Reserve has had an unprecedented increase in interest rates over the last few months. Russia continues to rattle everybody because, well, don't have to say more about that as they attack citizens in the Ukraine. But this number 4 was interesting to me, that as the midterm elections approach, there is this huge wave of negative ads about the other candidate, and that affects the perception of Americans on what's happening. So, you know, they only believe what's in the newspaper. Or Will Rogers said that, I only know what I read in the newspaper, or something like that, or saw on TV. And it affects people's buying behavior. This is the University of Michigan. They have a consumer sentiment ongoing pulse on the nation. And this is published by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And you can see in the graph the sentiment. You can see the 3 lines that the dark purple line is the sentiment line, but you can see it's dropped. And the gray bars going vertically in the graph are previous recessions. There was the recession of 2009, 2010, or 2008, 2009, previous one in the early 2000s, and a very brief one in the pandemic. But it looks kind of grim right now for a recession. Now, I just was not trying to paint a grim picture. It's just there's a lot of things going on right now. Some economists already believe we're in a recession, and inflation, of course, is a significant thing. So when you're planning your budgets for the coming fiscal year or years, there's just things to keep in mind during that kind of economic condition. You've lived through recession before. I don't think very many of us have seen this kind of inflation before, although I remember in the 1970s, the stagflation of the 70s, where inflation was high while being, high unemployment and in a recession, and gas lines at the gas pumps and things like that. So planning for lean times. What happens in a recession is that people start losing their jobs. When you lose your jobs, you might not be able to pay property taxes. You might not be able to donate as much money as you'd like to your favorite causes. revenues start drying up. I know in the last recession, in that early 2000s recession, and in the 2008 and 9 recession, as a financial manager, we had to look at payroll very carefully because 85% of our budget was payroll. So planning for lean times and good times is always a good thing to do. What would you do if you're presented with a flat budget with a 2% cut? What are those things that you'd look at? Innovate and adapt are very important aspects of approaching the problem, offering programs and products that are value to your customers, maintaining quality, showing value, and advocating for that value on your behalf. When you do something good, you show it to people who fund you. That would be the select board, that would be your friends, that would be your community that you work in. Jenny, who is going to be speaking in a few minutes, she told me the other day, she reminded me that, certain places actually thrive during a recession. And I'm thinking of a university. A lot of people go to school, for instance, in a recession. Okay, they lost their job or they just don't have any way forward. So let's get retrained. And we know that libraries are a lot of things to a lot of different places. They're a place for access computers, to do resumes, to do job searches. A library can really add value to the community during economic hard times, and that's a really, really important point to make public. Whoops, I think did I miss one? Oh, here it is. I always like to say, protect your workers first. When you're looking at a budget, if you're faced with a cut, what can you do to be creative with the operating expenses while maintaining your support of the employees that you have as well as yourself? Another side to unfortunate side, but good for employers in some respects, is that talent becomes available. So if you lose an employee, that they quit or through attrition retire, whatever, move on, then it's an opportunity to find great employees. Co-programming, building municipal and community relationships is important. Building cash reserves is a strategic thing that should be done over time. And usually if you're a municipal library, hopefully you're building cash reserves for capital expense projects, but also perhaps there's a way to use cash reserves as an emergency kind of thing. Diversifying revenue sources, we'll talk about that in a couple weeks, and protecting and growing your patron base. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to go very fast. I'm sorry. I want to talk about the impact of inflation on pay, and then pay and benefits. Trying to get better wages and moving up. This is the over the year changes in wage and salary. The New England is the red line. So the average increase in wages and salaries has been about 5%. And here in the yellow is overall, so it's 5.3% increase average in salaries from June 2021 through June 2022. 5.7% in the private sector, 3.2% in the state and local government sector. So this has been the average for this past year from June 2021 through 2022. And remember, this is information that you can use when you're talking to the trustees, when you're working with the select board, that these are things to keep in mind. This is just data for you to use. There is a living wage calculator, both at MIT as well as a basic needs budget, which is produced annually by the Vermont Legislative Joint Fiscal Office. And there's good quarterly census data that's available. But on the top right part of the slide, you can see this is from the MIT living wage calculation for Vermont. Right now, if you're one adult wage earner and you have one child on board, then the living wage, they estimate at $36 an hour. So these are data that you can use to try to make the case for you and your employees to your trustees as well as the select board. You know, it's expensive living in Vermont, and it's everything you can do to push forward on your pay scale is important to do. Top 10 reasons for raises in 2018. You can see performance was top, and I think this year and the coming year, it's really about the cost of living. And isn't it ironic, because what you have done to get through the pandemic has been spectacular, been amazing. I mean, just on merit alone, you should be being recognized financially for what you do. But you know, the cost of living right now, you know, used to be a 5 or 6 or 7% increase in pay was pretty astounding. It was real. It really increased your pay. But right now, that's what we need just to keep up to the cost of living. So on a raise the old boats kind of thing, the municipal libraries pay raises are linked to town, so you have to have that communication with the trustees. The link to the select board, it's about advocacy, it's about communication. And then incorporated libraries, really you're a barrel with your own bottom. The discretion of the trustees as the board of directors for the corporation. And of course, with an eye to the municipality, because we're all connected to towns, and that's you know, a relationship that has to be managed. Union shops, it's all about the contract. My union negotiated for 2022 through 24 a 1%, a 1%, and a 2% raise. I have a feeling the union might be more aggressive in negotiating 2025 through 28. I'm going to skip. Well, I'll go over this really fast. You can read faster than I can speak, but this is if you're specifically talking about yourself. And there's a link here that's a really good article about talking your way into a bigger raise. And I won't focus too much on here at all right now, because I want to get to Jenny. And really, I think when you're going into your budget and you're thinking about how much you make and how much your employees make, and thinking about next year and the year after, and I really would suggest strongly multiple year budgeting, you know, 2 or 3 years out, to connected to your strategic plan, but use the data that you have out there. And I've got some links here that you can use. People are your trustees, the select board, they know all about what's happening to inflation right now. And see what they're thinking, and then advocate for your best, the best amount you can get. And I had to put this in here because this is from, you know, this is also from the Society of HR Management, which I am a member of. The largest raises you'll ever typically get in your career are changing jobs, and this is true for me. I've changed jobs about every 5 years, whether I needed to or not. But 2 of those jobs were very significant changes, moving geographically, where both times were very significant, you know, raised 50% increase in pay. And I think that's what you find at UVM, for instance. You can get stuck in a job and you'll get the 2 or 3%, but you really need to move on to maybe a different department. Libraries are much more challenging because you know, there's not everyone wants to jump, not everyone can jump. I've been in the same place for a while because of family, because I didn't want to move anymore, because of all these other things. And I know a lot of you are very dedicated to your community. So really, it's about advocating for yourself with the trustees. Before, this is almost the last slide. I'll show you the last slide. See, this is the last slide discussion. But before that, before we talk, we asked Jenny to say a few words. Are there any questions? I know that was like drinking from a fire hose a bit, but it's all about, in this presentation, I wanted to at least give you things to think about with regard to your own salaries and the salaries, the hourly wages that you and your employees receive, some strategies and some data about that. And then start thinking about a little bit like, what happens with inflation still being high next year? What happens if a recession? Things to think about as you're budgeting. So I'm looking in the chat. I'll wait a few more seconds. There's one from Barbara in Windsor. Social Security COLA increase something that can help back up your request for higher salaries at the library. It could be, that's a really important part of the benefit budget is the goodness, I'm losing grip of my percentages. I think the library, I forgot what percent, 4.4%, 4.45% Social Security, 1.2% Medicare, maybe something like that. That's sort of like a non-discretionary cost, right? If the Social Security payroll tax goes up, then you would have to pay for this. But you're talking about the COLA. Yeah, I think you can use that. I think you can, because Social Security is receiving the highest cost of living increase in a long time, right? I think I just read that the other day. Joy, you have your hand up.
I do. It's kind of a vague question, but I'm wondering if you have any advice. Like, what if you know that your town doesn't really have that much money? And I've just heard librarians worry about that. Like, they know they're not getting paid very well, but they are also concerned that their town just doesn't have that many resources. And so we're sort of stuck in this cycle of low paying library jobs because the money's just not there, even if the trustees might mean well. So do you have any thoughts or advice on that?
Yeah, well, advice, I'm kind of maybe low on advice, but my thoughts on it are like when I paid my property tax bill yesterday. And so I've got a fresh memory of it. And I'm looking at my tax bill, and I knew this before, but I studied it even closer yesterday. The town part of that tax bill is really tiny. It's about the school cost. So the town tax, I think in Georgia, I think the town budget is really pretty small. It's like $2 million. And the school budget is like $12 million. And so, boy, I would push on that, like, listen, the town needs to be better resourced. I know what you're saying, and I've seen enough select board meetings. I've seen the pressure select board members are under. And I think it's my opinion over the decades, town employees, town services have taken never mind the back seat, like the back row of the bus compared to education funding. And because it's in the same bucket, when you receive that property tax bill, it's like you don't connect. You say, oh my God, the property taxes in this town are terribly high. Man, boy, what are they doing? I think I really wanted to advocate for higher salaries for everyone in the town, but it's tough. It's a tough nut to crack. Sorry, that was not a good answer for you, Joy.
There is another question in the chat too about what you mean by protecting your patron base.
Oh, I just mean retention of current patrons. That's right. Sorry, Jesse, for not using clear language. And an opportunity to reach, it also offers you an opportunity perhaps to reach patrons you haven't reached before. It's challenging to them. There's some people that haven't ever walked into the library that are decision makers that you want to reach. But That's what I was talking about. I'm sorry, I'm going to switch to Jenny. Sorry, Jenny, I took up about 10 more minutes than I meant to. So I want to introduce Jenny Rosicki, who is at the John McCullough Free Library, and she's got a compensation improvement story. And I'm going to stop sharing. And then take it away, Jenny. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm dealing with some new technology here.
I can hear you.
Great, okay. So I'm Jenny Rosicki. I'm the director at the John G. McCullough Free Library in North Bennington. And I guess this compensation improvement story starts with a pandemic boredom project. I'm sure we all had those. But I went back and read all of the director's reports and meeting minutes from like the dawn of time and put them in order. Just because I was curious about the governance and the director's history at the library. And a pattern that I noticed was that we would have a librarian pretty much since after 1960, I would say. We would have a librarian who would stay for a while and then get a job offer and she would leave. Well, she would get a job offer, ask for a raise, and then she would leave because it was not honored. So I noticed that precedent. And in the last year, I think that as other directors may have seen, there's a retention problem with your workforce, or your employees are perhaps being recruited away to other positions. And I was recruited for a number of different really compelling jobs, and we were headed into budgeting season. And I just sort of brought it up and said, look, I want to stay. I want to do right by this community. We're in the middle of a bunch of really big and necessary projects and a recovery from some dire financial situations and decisions that took place at the last recession. So I sort of sat down for that budgeting session and said, look, here's the pattern. What can we do? What is possible? And I had the right trustee sitting in on the right meeting with the right connections. So we are in the planning phases of a staff compensation fund. These would be earmarked funds kept in a separate endowment. The interest running off of that will be a supplement to regularly planned, what's already in the budget for salaries and benefits. And this also, so I knew that I had to measure a whole bunch of times and cut once. So I came up with a proposal that would bring me up to full-time, bring our youth services librarian up to full-time with benefits, competitive salaries, would have raised salaries across the board. So it was at least recognizing the good work and the professional work that my colleagues do. And also in response to what our community says it wants is an increase in the number of hours that will be open. So we were able to secure 2 years worth of bridge grant funding to put those changes in effect immediately. And we have some fundraising, but more than a match. I think it's 2.5 times, 2.25 times match on whatever we raise to create this fund that will generate enough interest to protect salary and benefits for staff. Because what's really undercut this organization and may have undercut others in a similar situation is turnover, is that lack of permanence and that lack of competitiveness in the library world, which can cause a bit of stagnation and not great practice. So I think that's my story. I may have even come in a little under time here, Gary, or am I right on time?
That's your story and you're sticking to it. Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm especially impressed at, well, there's a few things I'm impressed with. First is how you worked with data and how you did your research, going back in time, understanding your community, like they wanted more hours. And then the advocacy that you did, and also the persuasion that, that power of persuasion with data, with advocacy, talking about how strong the library is without that turnover, what it means from a staff perspective and in quality and institutional knowledge and that sort of stuff. So that's amazing. It's pretty astounding work. Now, Jenny, connecting what Vicky had written in there about suggestions, they had been very successful recently with grants and donations. And, Joy just asked a question about okay, if the town can't come up with any money, well, the most reasonable thing that you go to, rather than trying to get blood out of that particular stone, is finding other sources of revenue. And then, how do you manage getting other sources of revenue without the select board sitting back and saying, oh, well, we don't have to fund you as much, do we? But so I've heard those stories too. So there's a note from Vicky. Congratulations, Jenny. Very impressive case study you've shared with us.